In the Deep South, the majority of slaves lived and worked on these large cotton plantations. So like we talked about in the video from before, we saw that because of the cotton gin, the production of cotton, more and more cotton was needed. So these plantations had tons of slaves in order to make this happen. Well, this is what you imagine when you think of slavery in the South. However, this experience is rare. And what I mean by that is that over 75% of Southerners did not own slaves. So, yes, there were a lot of slaves on these big cotton plantations, but not everybody in the South had slaves. Okay, 75% of them, as I just said, did not own slaves. And of those who did, less than 1% of those owned 50 or more slaves. So you often would only own a few slaves if you had the opportunity to have some. Poor treatment and unsanitary conditions forced upon slaves, especially on these rice plantations in Georgia and South Carolina, led to an increasingly high infant mortality rate, which means as high as 90% in some areas. This means about 90% chance of an infant dying at birth. Okay, so that means out of 100 babies, about 90 of them would not sadly make it. In the Upper South, however, slave owners tended to own fewer slaves. And those slaves were often treated better, as described by a famed runaway slave and civil rights leader, Frederick Douglass. Slaves in the Upper South were often given more freedoms than others. Okay, I'm now going to ask you a question that you're going to answer. What can you assume by the treatment of the slaves that led to such a high infant mortality rate? So what do you think the conditions were like if that was sadly happening?